Hello and most welcome to 1546 of the series, and I will today bring up Joachim Schulte. He is in the same league as Paul Johnston as a Wittgenstein interpreter, perhaps even a bit more difficult, but we now had good training with Paul Johnston. I think we are free to continue. We have the necessary background, I would say. And this paper is called Saint Augustine and All That, Remarks on the Beginning of Philosophical Investigations. One way of identifying the beginning of the investigations is by deciding to regard remark 1, and hence neither the motto nor the preface, but the famous quotation from Augustine as the real starting point of Wittgenstein's reflections as developed in this book. One point implicit in this decision is that the notion of a language game is placed in the foreground of Wittgenstein's discussion. In a way, the language game of the builders is Wittgenstein's paradigm of language game. But why is it treated differently from the shopkeeper scene, in the sense that the latter is not given a separate number? This question appears particularly urgent in view of the fact that in earlier manuscript versions of the investigations, Wittgenstein did allot a separate number to the shopkeeper scene. Toward the end of this paper, I make an attempt to answer that question. But in order to get down to this, a number of additional questions are raised, focusing on Wittgenstein's use of central terms like game, operate, and sample, drawing on distinctions elaborated in the literature, such as Bernard Seraf's distinction between transitive and intransitive kinds of counting. This reading of the beginning of the investigations is impregnated with the conviction that later parts of the book can fruitfully be seen as growing out of the remarks immediately following the quotations from Augustine. One of the many striking things about the beginning of investigations is that it is not absolutely clear where the work begins. Does the preface form an integral part of the book? If not, what becomes of the motto, which after all was added to the first page of the typescript of the last version of the investigations? As we know, the Nestroy motto was added in 1947 or later to replace an earlier motto taken from Hertz's Principles of Mechanics. So one may wonder whether its inclusion was fully authorized by Wittgenstein, just as one may wonder whether the preface, which was written for an intermediate version of the work, was really meant to be printed in the form in which it has come down to us. But even if one leaves all these perplexity on one side and takes motto and preface at face value, one may wish to argue that, in the view of the fact that these items form parts of the preliminary or introductory material, they are not to be counted as constituting the beginning proper of the book. In the present context, I don't want to assess the value of this argument, nor do I want to express an opinion on any of the questions mentioned so far. I do, however, want to suggest that it can be helpful to consider the book as beginning with PI1, and hence with a well-known quotation from Augustine's Confessions and Wittgenstein's translation of this quotation. This passage from the Confessions is alluded to in manuscripts written as early as 1931 and in the Brown Book, which was dictated in the academic year 1934 to 1935. Wittgenstein takes the decisive step of opening the work with an explicit reference to this passage. There he writes, Augustine, in describing his learning of language, says that he was taught to speak by learning the names of things. This remark is followed by a comment similar to one we know from the beginning of the investigations. In the earlier work, Wittgenstein says that it is clear that whoever says this has in mind the way in which a child learns such words as man, sugar, table, etc. He does not primarily think of such words as today, not, but, perhaps. More than a year later, toward the beginning of the period of his long Norwegian retreat, Wittgenstein worked on a German version of the Brown Book, which he entitled Philosophische Untersuchungen, Philosophical Investigations. The beginning is similar to the one readers know from the English Brown Book, only that now a few lines from Augustine's text are quoted in the original Latin. As is well known, after having completed 2/3 or so of the Brown Book, revision, Wittgenstein abandoned this work and proceeded to assemble a new work, also entitled Philosophische Untersuchungen, which may be regarded as his first draft of what we know as the first 188 remarks of the published investigations we are familiar with. This manuscript was revised and typed in 1937, and it is this version which looks recognizably similar to the one we know from the printed work. Wittgenstein's translation of Augustine's words, however, was only added to the so-called intermediate versions of 1944 to 45. Here, I should like to point out a couple of small differences between early versions of the investigations on the one hand and the final version, hence the published book on the other. The first difference may appear trifling, but in the light of later commentary, it seems important to bear it in mind. The difference is this, that the second paragraph of remark 1 of PI consists of what used to be 2 paragraphs in the earlier versions of the text. That is to say, in these earlier versions, Wittgenstein made it clear that an extra step needs to be taken if one wishes to get from the picture yielded by the quotation taken from the confession to the idea, whose roots can be found in the picture. In other words, some, and perhaps a good deal of extra work is required to obtain the idea from the picture. The relevant paragraph run as follows. These words, it seems to me, give us a particular picture of the essence of human language. It is this The words in language name objects. Sentences are combinations of such names. In this picture of language, we find the roots of the following idea. Every word has a meaning. This meaning is correlated with the word. It is the object for which the word stands. So it is clear that the line should be drawn between the picture suggested by Augustine and the tripartite idea derived from this picture. And once this line is drawn, one may find that the picture is too unspecific and vague to yield the claim that could be seen as the direct source of something that might deserve to be called a philosophical or theoretical view of any kind. So if, as Wittgenstein writes in a fairly early manuscript, his point in quoting Augustine was that of mentioning the views of an unprejudiced and clear-thinking man who flourished in a much earlier period than ours and was alien to our own notions and preconceptions. We are probably expected to respond by saying something along the following lines. If this is a view held by an unprejudiced observer of the world surrounding him, then we shall need a good deal of reflection and theoretical work to arrive at the rudiments of something attracting and permitting philosophical discussion. And if this response is on the right track, we may wonder whether the translation rendering das Wesen der menschlichen Sprache as the essence of human language is not perhaps too specific, in that it suggests that the picture conveyed by Augustine's words is an essentialist one. This may be so. At any rate, the rudiments of something attracting and permitting philosophical discussion are only presented to us by the idea whose roots we may discover in the Augustinian picture proper. But if this is right, we should be aware of what I should not hesitate to call a fact versus the fact that the Augustinian picture properly so-called could give rise to a number of competing views on the nature of human language. And surely, among these views, there might be some that would not inevitably call forth criticism from Wittgenstein or another philosopher thinking along similar lines. Accordingly, paying attention to this small difference between earlier versions and the final version of the text of the investigations may help us to rethink and perhaps modify our attitude towards the Augustinian picture itself. By the same token, it may contribute to seeing the view criticized by Wittgenstein himself or by his commentators on his behalf as views we are more or less naturally inclined to hold. This, of course, does not render these views immune to criticism, but it may help us to see them as something deeply rooted in our own nature. This, by the way, is a way of looking at things endorsed by Wittgenstein himself when, in his remarks on Fraser, he insists on noting that magic and ritual actions can be understood to reflect our most basic instincts, and that magic in turn is always based on the idea of symbolism and language. Now, I should like to point out the second small difference between earlier and later versions of Remark 1 of the investigations. This difference concerns what is the concluding paragraph of this remark in the book as we know it. In earlier versions, however, this concluding paragraph did not form part of the first remark at all. In all earlier versions, up to the intermediate version of the 1944 to 45, this paragraph formed a remark of its own. It was only in the intermediate version that Wittgenstein changed the numbering and turned what used to be remark 2 into the last paragraph of remark 1. So by helping myself to appease terminology, Wittgenstein only introduces in remark 1. So by helping myself to a piece of terminology, Wittgenstein only introduces in remark 7. I might describe the situation by saying that one of the two parallel language games forming remarks 2 and 3 is deprived of its status and included in the first remark, where it figures as the last of 4 paragraphs, not counting the translations of the quotation from Augustine. At the first glance, at any rate, this modification by inclusion will seem like an odd decision on Wittgenstein's part. After all, these two language games, the shopkeeper's language game and that of the builders, are clearly of central importance. So why shouldn't they be allowed to continue to stand on the same level, as it were? And we continue. Sorry about the break. Now I should like to point out that the second small difference between earlier and later versions of remark 1 of the investigations. Oh, sorry, I started off wrong. This difference concerns what is the concluding paragraph of this remark in the book as we know it. In the earlier versions, however, this concluding paragraph did not form part of the first versions. First remark at all. In all earlier versions up to the intermediate version of 1944 to 45, this paragraph formed a remark of its own. It was only in the intermediate version that Wittgenstein changed the numbering and turned what used to be remark 2 into the last paragraph of remark 1. So by helping myself to a piece of terminology, Wittgenstein only introduces in remark 7. I might describe the situation by saying that one of the two parallel language games forming remarks 2 and 3 is deprived of its status and included in the first remark, where it figures as the last of 4 paragraphs. At first glance, at any rate, this modification by inclusion will seem like an odd decision on Wittgenstein's part. After all, these language games, the shopkeeper's language games and that of the builder, are clearly of central importance. So why should they be allowed to continue to stand on the same level, as it were? The architecture behind Wittgenstein's arrangement and numbering of his remarks seems almost to demand the earlier ordering. I think that here we are faced with a real puzzle. It is only towards the end of my paper that I shall venture a tentative answer to this problem. Now I shall quote the language game of the shopkeeper and discuss a few questions raised by it. Now think of the following use of language. I send someone shopping. I give him a slip of paper marked 5 red apples. He takes the slip to the shopkeeper, who opens the drawer marked apples. Then he looks up the word red in the chart and finds a color sample next to it. Then he says the series of elementary number words. I assume he knows them by heart, up to the word 5. And for each number word he takes up an apple of the same color as the sample. Out of the drawer, it is this and similar ways that one operates with words. But how does he know where and how he is to look up the word red, and what he is to do with the word 5? Well, I assume that he acts as if I have described. Explanations come to an end somewhere. But what is the meaning of the word 5? No such thing was in question here, only how the word 5 is used. And I think here you see there is multifarious ways of using an expression even like 5. Like this, like that, to count, to point to something, the fifth element, and so forth. But never, ever do we really ask for an inner meaning of the word 5. It is also the different uses of the word that is of elegant importance. That's the pertinent thing. Not what a so-called intention, if we take the language philosophers. As I said, the expression language game is only introduced in remark 7. But there can be no doubt that its use to classify the shopkeeper scenario is legitimate. After all, in later passages of the book, Wittgenstein himself explicitly speaks of 2 and 8 as language games. Accordingly, there seems to be no reason to refrain from using the word with reference to the shopkeeper example. What may be confusing is the circumstance that in the earlier parts of the book Wittgenstein calls 2 and 8 languages. It almost seems that in a few cases he uses the words language and language game interchangeably. It is important to note, and I remember this as Wittgenstein's repeated invitation to think of his example as complete languages. It's very important. It's very hard to make sense of if the term language is understood to referring to things of the same type as German or English, whereas the idea of completeness can get some grip if the word language is understood as referring to language games. That is to say, if you take a language game to be something like a model of a delimited use of linguistic expressions, and hence something as something that may be characterized by a kind of scenario or choreography, the question of completeness can begin to make sense. Analogous considerations apply to the idea of a fragment of a language. So what Wittgenstein here is pointing to in the words of Joachim Schulte is when we don't see the different uses of a word for what they are, their specific idiosyncratic uses, all specific, and most possibly not even reducible to the word use, because use itself has its place in a certain part of the language game. We begin to understand how we can make that mistake and start thinking of intention, meaning as sort of flying about somewhere in another sphere, lacking a founding part in the language game, being extraterrestrial if you want, like the UFOs flying about somewhere out in the air, doing nothing for no one. This is where all the transcendentalism starts, the problem with not understanding how to properly and accurately, skillfully use a word. It is obviously a lack of skill in our everyday use. Not by all, but some of us. And that lack of skill can lead to some other philosophical questions, the so-called ones as Wittgenstein would have it. Clarification is what he is after, first and foremost. And seeing that there is a tendency of unclearness coming from the everyday use of language and developing and strengthening by itself. He wants to get us on the right path again, the path that leads to understanding and better use. A skillful use of language and away from, as I mentioned in the penultimate lecture, 1544, away from the idea, from the tendency of time pressing on you because time has become something other, something transcendental, not of this world, something unreal, and unrealities are dangerous because you don't know how to enter into them. It's like a cold dark night saying there is something out there. It can actually be much scarier than seeing a wolf or a bear. There is something out there we don't know. This has this influence, and you do not have to be aware of it. It will play its role anyway, and you will unconsciously be ruled by these mistakes or misunderstandings. They will govern your decisions, they will govern your intentions, your doings in the world, and your understanding of it. And Wittgenstein is really showing us out of the bottle, so to speak, showing the fly out of the bottle, so we can, so to speak, gain free air once more. Still morning here. I'll say thank you very much and have a very pleasant morning. Bye bye for now.